Hi, I'm Mika. For 12 years, I've been wearing scrubs to work while my sister Rachel wore designer suits to her marketing executive job, constantly reminding me that I was just a nurse who would never amount to anything significant. Last weekend at our family reunion in Denver, she made her usual condescending remarks about my career choice in front of everyone, rolling her eyes when I tried to contribute to conversations about business and success. But when Dr. Harrison, the CEO of Presbyterian Medical Center, stood up at our table and announced to the entire room that I wasn't just any nurse, I was actually the owner of 3 private medical facilities and his biggest competitor, Rachel's face went completely white. You ever wondered what it feels like to watch someone realize they've been underestimating you for over a decade? Stick around, because what happened next changed everything between us forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I remember exactly what I was wearing that Saturday morning, when everything unraveled. A simple navy blue dress that I'd picked up from Target. Nothing fancy but professional enough for a family gathering. My hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, minimal makeup, the kind of understated appearance that had become my signature over the years. I'd learned early in my nursing career that standing out wasn't always beneficial, especially when you were working your way up in a field where many people had preconceived notions about what nurses could and couldn't achieve. The reunion was being held at the Marriott downtown, one of those elegant ballroom events that my Aunt Patricia loved to organize every few years to bring our scattered family together. I'd driven down from Fort Collins, where I lived in a modest 2-bedroom house. Nothing extravagant but comfortable and fully paid off, though none of my family knew about that last detail. In fact, there were quite a few details about my life that I'd kept private over the years. Not out of shame, but out of a desire to avoid the complicated conversations that would inevitably follow. Rachel had flown in from Los Angeles, where she worked for some high-profile advertising agency, and she'd made sure everyone knew about her first-class ticket, her corner office, and her 6-figure salary within the first 10 minutes of arriving. She had a way of commandeering conversations, steering them toward her accomplishments while somehow making everyone else feel smaller in comparison. It was a talent she'd perfected since we were children, and one that had only grown more refined with age. I watched her hold court near the registration table, her perfectly highlighted blonde hair catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. She was wearing what looked like a $1,000 blazer over designer jeans, her nails professionally manicured, her smile bright and confident, as she regaled our cousins with stories about her latest campaign for a luxury car brand. This was Rachel in her element, surrounded by an audience that hung on her every word, reinforcing the narrative she'd carefully constructed about herself over the years. "Mika," she called out when she spotted me approaching, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to appear affectionate while simultaneously establishing hierarchy. "There's my little sister, still saving lives one patient at a time." The way she said it made nursing sound like a hobby rather than a profession, something cute and noble but ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of things. I smiled and accepted her brief hug, feeling the familiar mixture of love and frustration that Rachel had always inspired in me. Despite everything, she was still my sister, and there was a part of me that remembered the girl who used to build blanket forts with me and defend me against playground bullies. But somewhere along the way, she'd decided that my choosing nursing over something more traditionally ambitious was a reflection of limited goals rather than genuine passion. "How's the hospital treating you?" she asked, and I could practically see her mentally filing away my response for later use in whatever narrative she was building about our respective life choices. "Still working those crazy hours?" Quote, "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now, back to the story. "I actually have more flexibility in my schedule these days," I replied, which was true, though not for the reasons she assumed. Over the past 5 years, I'd gradually transitioned from bedside nursing to administrative roles, though I still maintained my clinical skills and picked up shifts when needed. The truth was, my schedule was flexible because I was the one creating it, but explaining that would require explaining everything else, and I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The morning progressed predictably. Rachel introduced me to various family members as her nurse sister, always with a slight emphasis on the word that made it sound diminutive. When our cousin David mentioned his recent promotion to regional sales manager, Rachel immediately launched into a comparison of their respective career trajectories, casually mentioning her latest bonus and the size of her team. When I tried to contribute to a conversation about healthcare policy, she actually laughed and said, "Oh, Mika, you see things from such a ground-level perspective. It's sweet, but policy is really about the big picture." The dismissiveness stung, not because I doubted my own knowledge, but because it was so automatic, so reflexive. Rachel had spent years positioning herself as the successful sister, and me as the caring but ultimately less ambitious one. She'd created a narrative where my choosing a helping profession was evidence of either limited intelligence or limited drive, unable to conceive that someone might deliberately choose service over salary, impact over prestige. During lunch, I found myself seated at a table with several family members and, to my surprise, Dr. Harrison and his wife Margaret. I'd met Dr. Harrison through my work but hadn't expected him to be here. As it turned out, Margaret was my cousin Linda's college roommate, and they'd maintained a close friendship over the years. It was one of those small-world coincidences that happen more often than you'd expect, but in this case, it would prove to be particularly significant. Dr. Harrison was a distinguished man in his early 60s, silver-haired and soft-spoken, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of leadership in healthcare. He'd been CEO of Presbyterian Medical Center for over 15 years, transforming it from a struggling community hospital into one of the most respected medical facilities in the state. I'd worked with him on several projects over the years, though our professional relationship was something I'd kept separate from my family life for reasons that were about to become clear. "Mika," he said warmly when we were introduced in this context, "what a pleasant surprise. I had no idea you were Linda's cousin." Rachel, who had been regaling the table with a story about her latest client presentation, paused mid-sentence and looked between us with curiosity. "You two know each other?" "We've worked together on several occasions," Dr. Harrison replied diplomatically. "Mika has been instrumental in some important initiatives at the hospital." I could see Rachel processing this information, trying to fit it into her understanding of my career. In her mind, I was a bedside nurse who might occasionally attend meetings or participate in committees, not someone who worked directly with CEOs on major initiatives. The cognitive dissonance was visible on her face as she tried to reconcile these two images. "That's wonderful," she said finally, her tone suggesting she thought drive. Harrison was simply being polite about whatever minor contributions I might have made. "Mika has always been so dedicated to her patients. It's really admirable how some people find fulfillment in service roles." The phrase service roles hung in the air like a judgment, carrying with it all of Rachel's assumptions about hierarchy and worth. Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, and I saw something shift in his expression, though he maintained his diplomatic composure. As lunch progressed, Rachel dominated the conversation, steering it repeatedly toward her own accomplishments, while making subtle digs at what she perceived as my more modest achievements. When someone mentioned the challenges facing healthcare, she launched into a critique of government regulation and administrative inefficiency, speaking with the confidence of someone who'd read a few articles but had never actually worked within the system. "The problem with healthcare," she declared, gesturing with her wine glass, "is that it's run by people who don't understand business. You need real entrepreneurs, people who understand profit margins and market dynamics. Most people in healthcare are there because they're drawn to the caring aspect, which is lovely, but caring doesn't fix systemic problems." I felt my jaw tighten as she continued, essentially arguing that compassion and business acumen were mutually exclusive, that people who chose healthcare did so because they lacked the intelligence or ambition for real business. It was a perspective I'd encountered before, usually from people who'd never spent a day trying to balance quality patient care with operational efficiency, never had to make decisions that could affect both someone's life and the financial viability of an institution. "Actually," I said quietly, "I think you'd be surprised how much business understanding is required in healthcare these days. Running a medical facility requires expertise in finance, operations, human resources, regulatory compliance, strategic planning, and about a dozen other areas. The most successful healthcare leaders are usually people who understand both the clinical and business sides." Rachel smiled indulgently, the way you might smile at a child who'd offered a cute but irrelevant observation. I'm sure you've picked up some of that from being around administrators, but there's a difference between understanding something and actually doing it. Running a real business, making decisions that affect millions of dollars, managing complex operations, that requires a different skill set entirely. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, and I saw Dr. Harrison's expression grow more serious. Margaret, his wife, was looking between Rachel and me with obvious discomfort, clearly sensing the tension but unsure how to navigate it. You know, Rachel continued, warming to her theme, I've always thought Mika could have done more with her life if she'd been willing to think bigger. Nursing is noble, don't get me wrong, but it's ultimately a job where you follow other people's orders. Some people are leaders, and some people are followers. There's nothing wrong with being a follower, but let's not pretend it's the same thing as actually building something. The words hit like a slap, not because they were true, but because they revealed so clearly how little Rachel actually knew about my life, my work, or my accomplishments. She'd constructed an entire narrative about who I was based on her own assumptions and prejudices, never bothering to look deeper or ask more thoughtful questions. I felt something shift inside me, a decision crystallizing that had been building for years. I was tired of protecting Rachel's narrative at the expense of my own truth. I was tired of allowing her to diminish my accomplishments to maintain her sense of superiority. Most of all, I was tired of pretending that her ignorance was somehow my responsibility to manage. Rachel, I said, my voice calm but carrying a new edge, what exactly do you think I do for a living? She looked surprised by the question, as if the answer were obvious. You're a nurse. You work at the hospital, take care of patients, follow doctor's orders. It's important work, but it's not exactly rocket science. The table had gone quiet, everyone sensing that something significant was happening but not quite sure what. Dr. Harrison was watching me with interest, and I could see in his eyes that he understood exactly where this conversation was heading. And where do you think I work? I continued. At Presbyterian Medical Center, Rachel replied, though she was beginning to look uncertain, as if she was realizing there might be gaps in her knowledge. Sometimes, I agreed, but that's not where I spend most of my time. Rachel frowned, clearly confused. In her mind, I worked at the hospital as a staff nurse, picked up overtime shifts when I could, and lived paycheck to paycheck like most people in what she considered service jobs. The possibility that there might be more to my professional life had apparently never occurred to her. I don't understand, she said finally. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of misunderstanding and condescension about to be lifted. Rachel, I haven't been a staff nurse in over 8 years. I own 3 private medical facilities in northern Colorado. I employ over 200 people, including 47 nurses, 23 doctors, and dozens of support staff. Last year, my facilities generated over $50 million in revenue. The silence that followed was profound. Rachel stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been shock. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat gently. I can confirm that, he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position. Mika is actually one of our biggest competitors in the region. Her facilities have set new standards for patient care and operational efficiency. In fact, we've been trying to figure out how to match her patient satisfaction scores for the past 2 years. Rachel's mouth actually fell open. I could see her trying to process this information, trying to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the reality that was being presented to her. That's impossible, she said weakly. You live in that little house in Fort Collins. You drive a Honda Civic. You shop at Target. I do, I agreed. Because those choices reflect my values, not my income. I could afford a mansion and a luxury car, but I'd rather invest in my facilities, my staff, and my community. Owning a successful business doesn't mean I have to change who I am. The truth was, my lifestyle choices had been deliberate. After my first facility became profitable, I could have easily afforded all the status symbols that Rachel associated with success. But I'd seen too many people in healthcare prioritize profit over patients. Too many leaders who lost sight of their mission in pursuit of personal wealth. I'd chosen to reinvest most of my profits back into my facilities, to pay my staff above market wages, to maintain equipment and facilities that exceeded industry standards. "But why didn't you tell me?" Rachel asked, and for the first time her voice carried something other than condescension. There was genuine confusion there, and perhaps a hint of hurt. "When would I have told you?" I asked gently. "When you were explaining how I'd never understand real business? When you were telling our cousins about the importance of ambition and drive? When you were suggesting that people in healthcare are there because they lack other options?" Rachel flinched as if I'd hit her, and I realized she was beginning to understand how her words had sounded, how her assumptions had affected our relationship over the years. Dr. Harrison spoke into the silence. "If I may," he said diplomatically, "I think there might be some misconceptions about what modern healthcare leadership entails. Mika didn't just stumble into business ownership. She spent years learning every aspect of healthcare operations, from clinical protocols to financial management to regulatory compliance. She earned her MBA while working full-time, completed advanced certifications in healthcare administration, and built her facilities from the ground up. What she's accomplished requires exactly the kind of vision, intelligence, and business acumen that any successful entrepreneur needs." I felt a flush of gratitude toward Dr. Harrison for his support, but also a sadness that it had taken an outside authority figure to make Rachel listen to information about my own life and accomplishments. "I don't understand why you would hide this," Rachel said, her voice smaller now, less certain. "Why wouldn't you want people to know how successful you are?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself as well. Why had I allowed her narrative to persist for so long? Why had I protected her feelings at the expense of my own truth? "Because success isn't just about money or status," I said finally. "It's about impact, about purpose, about building something that matters. My facilities have saved lives, provided jobs, improved the health of our community. That's what I'm proud of, not the financial metrics or the business recognition." But even as I said it, I knew there was more to it than that. The truth was, I'd been afraid of changing the dynamic between us, afraid that revealing my success would further complicate an already difficult relationship. Rachel had built her identity around being the successful sister, the ambitious one, the leader. Taking that away from her had felt cruel, even when maintaining it meant accepting her diminishment of my own accomplishments. "You let me make a fool of myself," Rachel said quietly, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "All those times I talked about business and success and leadership, you just sat there and let me act like I knew more than you." "You did know more," I said truthfully. "About marketing, about corporate culture, about your industry. Success isn't a competition, Rachel. Your accomplishments don't become less meaningful because mine are different than you thought." But I could see that wasn't how she was processing it. For Rachel, success had always been relative, meaningful only in comparison to others. Learning that I'd achieved something she hadn't expected was forcing her to reconsider not just our relationship, but her entire understanding of achievement and worth. The rest of the lunch passed in awkward conversation, with family members unsure how to navigate the new dynamic that had emerged. Some seemed impressed by the revelation about my business ownership, others appeared skeptical, as if they couldn't quite believe that quiet, unassuming Mika could be running a multi-million-dollar enterprise. But it was Rachel's reaction that affected me most. She became unusually quiet, picking at her food and responding to questions with uncharacteristic brevity. I could see her struggling to process not just the information about my career, but what it meant about our relationship, about the assumptions she'd made, about the way she'd treated me over the years. As the afternoon wore on and people began to leave, Rachel approached me near the coat check. Her designer confidence had been replaced by something more vulnerable, more uncertain. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. "Maybe get coffee or something?" I nodded, recognizing that this conversation had been years in the making. We found a quiet corner of the hotel lobby, settling into leather chairs with cups of coffee that neither of us seemed particularly interested in drinking. "I owe you an apology," Rachel said without preamble. "Not just for today, but for years of treating you like you were somehow less than me." I started to protest, but she held up a hand. No, let me say this. I've been thinking about it all afternoon, and I realize how awful I must have sounded. All those comments about ambition and leadership and real business. God, Mika, I was talking to someone who was actually doing all of those things while I was just talking about them. There was genuine remorse in her voice, but also something else. Confusion, perhaps, or a kind of wounded pride that came from realizing she'd been wrong about something so fundamental. "Why didn't you correct me?" she asked. "Why did you let me go on like that?" It was the same question she'd asked earlier, but this time it carried more weight, more genuine curiosity about my motivations. "Because correcting you would have required explaining everything," I said slowly, "and I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it. You had this narrative about who we both were, and challenging that narrative felt like it would hurt you more than help either of us." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, processing this. "You were protecting me," she said finally, and there was something like wonder in her voice, as if this was a completely foreign concept. "I was protecting our relationship," I corrected. "Or at least, I thought I was. I didn't want success to become another thing that divided us." "But it already was dividing us," Rachel pointed out. "My perception of your success, anyway. I was treating you like you were someone to be pitied, rather than someone to be respected." She was right, of course. My attempt to preserve our relationship by hiding my accomplishments had actually damaged it, creating a dynamic where she felt superior and I felt diminished, where authentic connection became impossible because it was based on false premises. "I need you to know something," Rachel said, leaning forward in her chair. "I'm proud of you, not just for what you've accomplished, but for how you've accomplished it. The fact that you built something this significant, while staying true to your values, while maintaining your relationships, while still actually caring for patients, that's incredible." The words meant more to me than I'd expected. For all her flaws, Rachel's opinion mattered to me, and hearing her acknowledge what I'd achieved felt like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. "Thank you," I said simply. "But I also need to understand something," she continued. "What made you decide to reveal all of this today? Why now?" I considered the question, thinking about the moment when something had shifted inside me, when I decided I was done protecting her narrative at the expense of my own truth. "Because I realized that hiding my success wasn't protecting our relationship," I said finally. "It was preventing us from having a real relationship. You can't truly know someone if you don't know what they've accomplished, what they're passionate about, what drives them. I was letting you love a version of me that didn't really exist." Rachel nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. "And because," I continued, "I was tired of feeling like I had to choose between my accomplishments and your approval. Both of those things should be able to exist simultaneously." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of what had shifted between us. Years of misunderstanding and resentment were beginning to dissolve, replaced by something more honest and more complex. "Can I ask you something?" Rachel said eventually. "Of course." "What's it actually like, running those facilities, making those kinds of decisions?" For the first time in our adult lives, she was asking about my work with genuine curiosity rather than condescending interest. I found myself describing the challenges and rewards of healthcare entrepreneurship, the complexity of balancing patient care with financial sustainability, the satisfaction of creating jobs, and improving community health outcomes. Rachel listened with real attention, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated her business acumen, while showing respect for the healthcare-specific challenges I faced. It was the kind of conversation I'd always hoped we could have, professional equals discussing their respective fields with mutual respect and interest. As evening approached and the hotel lobby began to fill with other guests, we finally acknowledged that we should probably head home. But something fundamental had changed between us, a shift that felt both dramatic and overdue. "I want to see them," Rachel said as we gathered our coats. "Your facilities, I mean. I want to understand what you've built." "I'd love to show you," I replied, meaning it completely. As we hugged goodbye, Rachel whispered, "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you." Driving home to Fort Collins that evening, I reflected on the day's events and what they meant for our relationship going forward. The revelation of my business ownership had been dramatic, but the real transformation was more subtle and more significant. For the first time in years, Rachel and I had talked to each other as equals, with mutual respect and genuine curiosity about each other's lives. I thought about Dr. Harrison's intervention and how different the day might have gone without it. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to force people to see what's been in front of them all along. His validation of my accomplishments had been important not because I needed his approval, but because it had forced Rachel to confront her assumptions in a way that my words alone might not have achieved. But mostly, I thought about the relief of finally being known, fully and honestly, by my sister. For years, I'd carried the weight of her misconceptions, allowing her narrative about our respective lives to persist because challenging it felt too difficult, too risky. Today had shown me the cost of that choice, but also the possibility of something better. The woman who drove home that night was the same person who'd driven to Denver that morning, but something essential had shifted. I was no longer hiding my accomplishments or protecting someone else's feelings at the expense of my own truth. I was finally fully authentically myself in all of my relationships, and that felt like the greatest success of all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build on what I'd created both professionally and personally. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt completely seen and understood by the sister I'd always hoped to have a real relationship with. And that, I realized, was worth more than any business achievement or financial success could ever be. The weeks following the reunion felt like living in a completely different world. Rachel called me 3 times in the first week alone, something that hadn't happened since we were teenagers. Our conversations were tentative at first, both of us navigating this new dynamic, where she could no longer dismiss my opinions as naive or uninformed. I found myself actually looking forward to her calls, curious to see how our relationship would evolve now that the fundamental power imbalance between us had shifted. It was during one of these calls that she mentioned wanting to visit my facilities, and I realized I was both excited and nervous about showing her what I'd built. The Mika she thought she knew would never have been capable of creating what I was about to show her, and I wondered if seeing it in person would help her understand not just what I'd accomplished, but who I'd always been underneath her assumptions. I scheduled her visit for a Thursday morning, planning to start at my flagship facility in Fort Collins, before moving to the smaller locations in Loveland and Greeley. As I prepared for her arrival, I found myself seeing my own workplace through fresh eyes, noticing details I'd grown accustomed to, but that might surprise someone experiencing it for the first time. Mika's medical center wasn't what most people expected when they heard about a private healthcare facility. Instead of the sterile, institutional feel of many hospitals, I designed the space to feel more like a high-end wellness center. The lobby featured warm wood floors, comfortable seating arrangements, and large windows that flooded the space with natural light. Local artwork decorated the walls, much of it created by patients or staff members, giving the space a personal, community-centered feel that reflected my vision for what healthcare could be. Rachel arrived precisely on time, dressed in business casual attire that suggested she was taking this visit seriously. I watched her face as she entered the lobby, seeing her surprise at the welcoming atmosphere and the obvious investment in creating a space that prioritized patient comfort and dignity. "This is beautiful," she said, and I could hear the genuine appreciation in her voice. "It feels more like a spa than a medical facility." That was intentional, I explained, as I led her toward the patient care areas. People are already anxious when they need medical care. The environment shouldn't add to that stress. As we walked through the facility, I found myself explaining not just what we did, but why we did it the way we did. Each decision, from the layout of the exam rooms to the scheduling software we used, had been made with patient experience and staff efficiency in mind. It was a delicate balance, ensuring that our focus on patient care didn't compromise our ability to operate profitably, but it was a balance I'd learned to strike through years of trial and error. "How many patients do you see here daily?" Rachel asked as we observed the busy but calm activity of the main corridor. "About 150 on average," I replied. "We handle everything from routine checkups to minor surgical procedures. The goal is to provide comprehensive care that keeps people out of the emergency room unless they truly need to be there." I introduced her to Dr. Sarah Chen, my medical director, who had been with me since I opened the first facility 4 years ago. Dr. Chen had left a position at Denver Health to join my team, drawn by the vision of practicing medicine without the bureaucratic constraints and time pressures that characterized many larger healthcare systems. Working here is completely different from anywhere else I've practiced, Dr. Chen explained to Rachel as we stood in her office overlooking the treatment area. Mika has created an environment where we can actually spend time with patients, where we have the resources we need, where we're encouraged to innovate and improve, rather than just follow protocols. I could see Rachel processing this information, beginning to understand that my facilities weren't just successful businesses, but were actually changing how healthcare was delivered in our community. It wasn't enough for me to create profitable enterprises. They had to serve a larger purpose, had to represent an improvement over what existed before. We spent time in the laboratory, where I explained how we'd invested in equipment that allowed us to provide same-day results for most tests, eliminating the anxiety and inconvenience of waiting days for critical information. In the pharmacy, Rachel met Jennifer, our lead pharmacist, who described how our integrated approach allowed for better medication management and patient education than the fragmented system most people experienced. The difference is coordination, Jennifer explained. When your primary care provider, your specialists, your lab, and your pharmacy are all working together under one roof, communication improves dramatically. Patients get better care, and honestly, it makes our jobs more satisfying too. As we moved through different departments, I watched Rachel's understanding deepen. She began asking more sophisticated questions about workflow optimization, staff retention, and quality metrics. Her background in business strategy was evident in how quickly she grasped the operational complexities involved in running a healthcare facility. "What's your staff turnover rate?" she asked as we observed the nursing station. "About 12% annually," I replied. "Industry average is closer to 30% for nursing staff." "How do you achieve that?" "Pay above market rate, provide excellent benefits, maintain appropriate staffing ratios so people aren't constantly overwhelmed, and create a culture where people feel heard and valued," I explained. "It costs more upfront, but the savings in training costs and the improvement in patient care more than justify the investment." This was the kind of conversation I'd always hoped to have with Rachel, where her business expertise and my healthcare knowledge could create a meaningful dialogue. She was seeing firsthand how the principles she understood from other industries applied to healthcare, but also how the unique challenges of medical care required innovative solutions. Our next stop was the urgent care section, where we observed the streamlined process I'd developed for handling non-emergency cases. Patients were triaged quickly but thoroughly, ensuring that serious conditions were identified while minor issues were resolved efficiently. The system reduced wait times while maintaining high standards of care, something that had taken months of refinement to perfect. The key insight was understanding that efficiency and quality aren't mutually exclusive, I explained as we watched a nurse practitioner conduct a thorough evaluation of a child's ear infection. Most urgent care facilities sacrifice one for the other. We invested in better staffing and better systems so we could achieve both. Rachel was taking notes on her phone, a habit I remembered from our childhood when she was genuinely interested in something. She asked detailed questions about patient flow, revenue cycles, and quality assurance protocols, demonstrating that she was taking this tour seriously as a business education rather than just a family obligation. We spent considerable time in the administrative offices, where Rachel met my business manager, Tom Rodriguez, who had helped me navigate the complex regulatory and financial requirements of healthcare entrepreneurship. Tom had an MBA from UC Denver and had previously worked for several large healthcare systems before joining my team. "The challenge in healthcare," Tom explained to Rachel, "is that you're simultaneously running a medical practice, a technology company, a human resources operation, and a complex compliance organization. Most physicians aren't trained for that level of business complexity, which is why so many practices struggle financially." "How did Mika prepare for all of this?" Rachel asked, and I appreciated that she was asking Tom rather than assuming I couldn't speak to my own preparation. "She earned her MBA while working full-time as a nurse," Tom replied. "But more than that, she spent years learning every aspect of healthcare operations. She worked in quality improvement, patient relations, financial management, and regulatory compliance, before ever considering opening her own facility. By the time she was ready to start this place, she understood the business as well as the medicine. I saw Rachel glance at me with what looked like newfound respect. The image she'd had of me stumbling into business success was being replaced by an understanding of the deliberate preparation and strategic thinking that had actually been involved. The other thing that sets Mika apart, Tom continued, is that she never lost sight of why healthcare exists. Every business decision gets evaluated against the impact on patient care. That philosophy attracts amazing staff and creates loyal patients, which drives long-term success even when it costs more in the short term. As we prepared to leave for the second facility, Rachel asked if we could grab coffee and talk privately. We found a quiet corner of the lobby cafe, and I could see that she was processing everything she'd observed. "I need to apologize again," she said without preamble. "Not just for underestimating you, but for completely misunderstanding what you do. I thought healthcare was somehow simpler or less sophisticated than other industries. What you've built here is incredibly complex and impressive." "Thank you," I said, genuinely appreciating her acknowledgement. "But I also want you to know that what you do in marketing is equally complex in its own way. Success isn't a hierarchy, Rachel. It's about finding where your talents and interests intersect with opportunities to create value." She nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot since the reunion. I think I made success into a competition between us, instead of recognizing that we were both succeeding in different ways." This conversation felt like a breakthrough, not just in our relationship, but in Rachel's understanding of achievement more broadly. For years, she'd operated from a scarcity mindset, where one person's success somehow diminished another's. Seeing what I'd built was helping her recognize that success could be collaborative rather than competitive. "Can I ask you something personal?" Rachel said as we prepared to leave for the next facility. "Of course. Are you happy? I mean, this is obviously successful and impressive, but does it fulfill you the way you hoped it would?" It was a thoughtful question, one that went beyond financial metrics or professional recognition to the heart of what mattered. I considered it carefully before responding. "Yes," I said finally. "Not every day and not every aspect of it. Running a business is challenging and sometimes frustrating, but knowing that what I've created genuinely improves people's lives, that I've created good jobs for amazing people, that I'm contributing to my community in a meaningful way, that fulfills me in ways that no amount of money or recognition could." Rachel smiled, and I could see that she understood. "That's what I was missing," she said. "I was so focused on the external markers of success that I never asked whether you were actually happy with your choices." The drive to Loveland gave us time to continue this conversation, and I found myself sharing details about my journey that I'd never told anyone, even Julian, the physician assistant I'd been quietly dating for the past 6 months. I told Rachel about the nights I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning studying for my MBA, while working 12-hour shifts at the hospital. I described the months of research and planning that had gone into designing the first facility, the countless meetings with contractors, regulators, and potential staff members. "The hardest part wasn't the business planning or the financial risk," I explained as we drove through the Colorado countryside. "It was believing that I was capable of leading something this significant. I'd spent so many years in roles where other people made the big decisions that stepping into that level of responsibility felt overwhelming." "What changed?" Rachel asked. "I realized that no one else was going to create the kind of healthcare environment I wanted to work in," I said. "I could either keep hoping someone else would do it, or I could learn how to do it myself." The Loveland facility was smaller but equally well designed, focused primarily on preventative care and chronic disease management. Here, I introduced Rachel to Maria Santos, a nurse practitioner who specialized in diabetes education and had helped hundreds of patients avoid serious complications through better self-management. "What Mika has created here is revolutionary," Maria explained as she showed us the Diabetes Education Center. "Instead of just treating people when they get sick, we're helping them stay healthy. The long-term impact on their quality of life is incredible, and it actually reduces healthcare costs for everyone." Rachel spent time observing a diabetes support group that met weekly at the facility, watching as patients shared strategies for managing their condition while supporting each other through the challenges of lifestyle change. It was healthcare as community building, an approach that prioritized relationships and empowerment alongside medical treatment. This is what I meant about fulfillment, I explained to Rachel as we watched the group interaction. These people aren't just patients anymore. They're partners in their own care, and they're helping each other succeed. That transformation is what makes all the business complexity worthwhile. Our final stop was the Greeley facility, which focused on occupational health and served several local manufacturing companies. Here, the emphasis was on preventing workplace injuries and helping injured workers return to productivity as quickly and safely as possible. Rachel met David Kim, our occupational health specialist, who explained how our proactive approach had reduced workplace injuries at client companies by over 40% while improving employee satisfaction and productivity. Traditional occupational health is reactive, David explained. Someone gets hurt, we treat them, and we hope it doesn't happen again. Mika's approach is to identify risk factors before injuries occur and work with companies to create safer work environments. What's the business case for prevention? Rachel asked, her strategic mind immediately grasping the key question. Healthier workers are more productive, take fewer sick days, and have lower healthcare costs, David replied. Companies that invest in prevention see measurable returns on investment within the first year. It's good business that happens to align with good medicine. As we concluded the tour and drove back toward Fort Collins, Rachel was quiet for a long time, processing everything she'd seen and learned. Finally, she spoke. "I owe you more than an apology," she said. "I owe you recognition for what you've accomplished and respect for who you are. What you've built isn't just impressive from a business standpoint. You're actually changing people's lives in meaningful ways." "Thank you," I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "That means everything to me, especially coming from you." "Why especially from me?" she asked. "Because despite everything, your opinion has always mattered to me," I admitted. "You're my sister, and you're brilliant at what you do. Having your respect and understanding feels like coming home in a way I didn't expect." Rachel reached over and squeezed my hand. "You have it," she said simply. "Completely and permanently." That evening, as I reflected on the day, I realized that showing Rachel my facilities had been about more than proving my success or changing her perception of my capabilities. It had been about sharing my passion and my purpose with someone whose approval I'd always wanted but never felt I could earn on my own terms. For the first time in our adult relationship, Rachel saw me not as the little sister who'd chosen a safe, predictable path, but as an entrepreneur and leader who'd taken significant risks to create something meaningful. More importantly, she understood that my success hadn't come at the expense of my values or my relationships, but had actually been built upon them. The woman who went to bed that night felt different from the one who'd woken up that morning. I was still the same person with the same accomplishments, but now those accomplishments were fully recognized and appreciated by someone whose opinion had shaped my self-perception for decades. It was a small shift in some ways, but it felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to complete for years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to grow both my business and my relationships. But tonight, I fell asleep knowing that my sister finally saw me for who I really was, and that knowledge felt like the greatest success of all. 3 months after Rachel's visit to my facilities, I thought our relationship had finally found its equilibrium. We talked regularly, she asked thoughtful questions about my work, and she'd even started referring business contacts to me when they needed healthcare consulting. I believed we'd moved past the years of misunderstanding and condescension into something healthier and more authentic. Then the phone call came on a Tuesday evening in late November. I was reviewing financial reports for the third quarter when Rachel's name appeared on my screen. But the voice that answered wasn't the composed, confident sister I'd grown accustomed to. "Mika, I need your help," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I think I'm about to lose everything." My first instinct was medical concern. "Are you hurt? Are you sick? What's wrong?" "No, not like that," she said, and I heard her take a shaky breath. "It's work. The agency is collapsing, and I might be facing criminal charges." I set down my reports and gave her my full attention. Over the next hour, Rachel explained a situation that was far more serious than I'd initially understood. The advertising agency where she'd worked for 6 years was under investigation for fraudulent billing practices that had apparently been going on for months before Rachel discovered them. As a senior executive, she was being scrutinized by federal investigators who were trying to determine whether she'd been complicit or simply negligent in her oversight responsibilities. "I found the discrepancies 3 weeks ago," she explained, her voice hollow with exhaustion. Phantom clients, inflated invoices, money being moved around in ways that made no sense. When I brought it to the CEO's attention, he fired me on the spot and claimed I was trying to cover up my own misconduct. The sister I'd known my entire life, the one who'd always seemed so in control of her professional destiny, sounded defeated in a way I'd never heard before. She explained how she'd been terminated without severance, how her professional reputation was being systematically destroyed by her former colleagues, how the legal fees were draining her savings while she waited to learn whether she'd face charges. "The worst part," she said, "is that I actually believed I understood how business worked. I thought I was sophisticated, strategic, successful. Turns out I was just naive enough to trust the wrong people and arrogant enough to think I could never be caught off guard like this." I heard echoes of our old dynamic in her words, but reversed. Now she was the one questioning her competence and business acumen, while I was the one with the stable, successful enterprise. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "What do you need?" I asked, cutting through her self-recrimination to focus on practical solutions. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been in a situation like this. I don't know how to fight back when people are lying about me, how to protect myself legally, how to survive financially while everything gets sorted out." It struck me that Rachel had spent years operating in environments where image and perception mattered more than substance, where political maneuvering was often more important than actual results. She developed skills in presentation and persuasion, but she'd never had to navigate a genuine crisis where her reputation and livelihood were under direct attack. "Come to Colorado," I said without hesitation. "Stay with me while you figure this out. You need space to think and plan, and you need to be somewhere the lawyers and investigators can't ambush you every day." There was a long pause before she responded. "I can't ask you to do that. This mess could go on for months, and if it gets worse, it might reflect badly on you and your business." "Let me worry about my business," I replied firmly. "You're my sister, and you're in trouble. That's the only consideration that matters right now." The woman who arrived at Denver International Airport 3 days later bore little resemblance to the polished executive I'd grown up with. Rachel looked exhausted, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual designer attire. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she carried a single suitcase that contained what she'd described as the only things I'm sure they can't take away from me. Driving her back to Fort Collins, I was struck by how different this felt from every other interaction we'd had as adults. For the first time, I was the stable one, the one with resources and perspective to offer. Rachel was vulnerable in a way I'd never seen, stripped of the professional armor that had defined her for so long. "Thank you for this," she said quietly as we pulled into my driveway. "I know it's a lot to ask." "You didn't ask," I pointed out. "I offered. There's a difference." Over the next few days, I watched Rachel struggle with the reality of having no structure, no office to go to, no meetings to attend. She'd built her identity around being busy and important, and suddenly having nothing but uncertainty and legal documents to occupy her time was clearly disorienting. "I keep waking up thinking I'm late for something," she confided over coffee one morning. "Then I remember that I don't have anywhere to be." I suggested she might want to talk to Dr. Patricia Williams, a counselor I knew who specialized in helping professionals navigate career transitions and trauma. Rachel initially resisted, claiming she didn't need therapy, but eventually agreed to meet with Dr. Williams after I pointed out that this situation was traumatic whether she acknowledged it or not. Meanwhile, I helped her organize her legal defense and financial planning. My experience in healthcare had taught me how to work with lawyers and navigate complex regulatory situations, skills that translated surprisingly well to Rachel's circumstances. I connected her with Jennifer Morrison, an attorney I knew who specialized in white-collar defense, and helped her gather the documentation needed to prove her innocence. "You're good at this," Rachel observed one evening as we reviewed her employment contract and email records. "The strategic thinking, the attention to detail, the way you can see patterns in complex information. You would have made an excellent attorney yourself." I considered it briefly, I admitted, but I realized I preferred solving problems rather than just arguing about them. As weeks passed, I watched Rachel begin to recalibrate her understanding of success and failure. The sister who'd once measured worth entirely in terms of salary and status was being forced to confront what really mattered when everything external was stripped away. "I've been thinking about what you said at the reunion," she told me one December morning as we walked around the neighborhood. "About fulfillment versus recognition. I don't think I ever asked myself whether I was actually happy with my work, just whether other people were impressed by it." "What's the answer?" I asked. She was quiet for several minutes, considering the question seriously. "I loved the creative parts of advertising," she said finally. "The strategy sessions, the brainstorming, the moment when you found the perfect way to connect a product with an audience. But most of my job had become managing people and processes, fighting for budgets, dealing with office politics. I hadn't done actual creative work in years." This conversation continued over many days, as Rachel slowly worked through the psychological impact of her professional crisis. She began to recognize patterns in her career choices that prioritized external validation over personal satisfaction, advancement over alignment with her values. "I think I spent so much time trying to prove I was successful that I never stopped to ask what success meant to me personally," she reflected during one of our evening talks. The legal situation progressed slowly but positively. Jennifer Morrison was able to demonstrate that Rachel had acted appropriately when she discovered the fraudulent practices, and that her termination was clearly retaliatory rather than justified. The federal investigation was focusing on the agency's ownership and upper management, with Rachel increasingly viewed as a witness rather than a suspect. But even as the legal clouds began to clear, Rachel seemed reluctant to return to Los Angeles or to resume her previous career trajectory. She'd started volunteering at one of my facilities, helping with patient education materials and community outreach programs. Her marketing expertise was valuable in healthcare settings, and she seemed energized by work that had clear social benefit rather than purely commercial goals. "I never realized how much difference it makes when your work actually helps people," she told me after spending a day helping elderly patients understand their Medicare options. "In advertising, success was measured by whether we convinced people to buy things. Here, success is measured by whether we actually improve someone's life." The transformation I was witnessing wasn't just about career direction, but about fundamental values and priorities. The sister who'd once dismissed service-oriented work as insufficiently ambitious was discovering that purpose-driven work could be more fulfilling than status-driven achievement. In January, Jennifer Morrison called with the news we'd been hoping for. The federal investigation had concluded without charges against Rachel, and her former employer had agreed to a settlement that included severance pay and a neutral reference letter. She was free to resume her career wherever and however she chose. "So what now?" I asked as we celebrated the legal victory over dinner at our favorite restaurant in downtown Fort Collins. "I've been thinking about that," Rachel said, and I could see excitement building in her eyes for the first time in months. "What if I stayed in Colorado? What if I started my own consulting practice focused on healthcare marketing and communications?" The idea had obvious merit. Rachel's skills in brand development, strategic communication, and market analysis were exactly what many healthcare organizations needed, but couldn't afford to hire full-time. My own facilities could provide case studies and references, and the Colorado healthcare market was large enough to support a specialized consulting practice. "You'd be giving up a lot," I pointed out. "The salary potential in healthcare is probably lower than what you could make returning to traditional advertising. But I'd be gaining a lot too," she replied. "Work that matters. A location where I want to live. The opportunity to be close to family. The chance to build something myself rather than just climbing someone else's ladder." Over the following weeks, we worked together to develop a business plan for Rachel's consulting practice. It was fascinating to see how her marketing expertise combined with her newfound understanding of healthcare to create insights that neither of us could have reached independently. "Healthcare organizations are terrible at communicating with patients," she observed during one of our planning sessions. They use jargon, they focus on features instead of benefits, they make everything sound complicated and intimidating. But patients need clear, compassionate communication that helps them understand their options and feel confident about their decisions. She was right, and I could see immediately how her skills could improve patient engagement and satisfaction at healthcare facilities throughout the region. We spent hours discussing the specific challenges healthcare organizations faced in building trust with patients, communicating complex medical information, and differentiating themselves in competitive markets. The best part, Rachel said as we finalized her business plan, is that success in this field will be measured by whether I actually help healthcare organizations serve their patients better. The better I do my job, the better they do theirs, and the more people benefit from improved healthcare access and understanding. By March, Rachel had incorporated her consulting practice and signed her first 3 clients, including a regional hospital system that needed help communicating about a major expansion project. She'd found a small office space in downtown Fort Collins and was working with the same energy and focus I remembered from our childhood, but now directed toward work that aligned with her values as well as her skills. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," she told me as we celebrated her first successful client presentation. Not just for the financial support or the legal help, but for showing me what it looks like to build a career around purpose instead of just ambition. "You don't owe me anything," I replied. "This is what family does. We support each other through difficult times, and we celebrate each other's successes." But privately, I was amazed by the transformation I'd witnessed. The crisis that had initially seemed like it might destroy Rachel's career had instead forced her to examine her priorities and rebuild her professional life on a more authentic foundation. She was still ambitious and strategic, but now those qualities were serving goals that mattered to her personally rather than just advancing her status. The sister who'd once dismissed my career choices as insufficiently sophisticated was now building her own business around serving the healthcare sector. She'd discovered that meaningful work didn't require sacrificing intelligence or ambition, just redirecting them toward purposes that created value beyond personal advancement. As spring arrived in Colorado, I reflected on how much our relationship had changed over the past year. We'd moved from a dynamic based on competition and comparison to one based on mutual support and respect. Rachel's crisis had given us the opportunity to support each other in ways we'd never experienced before, and it had ultimately strengthened both of us. The woman who'd once felt the need to diminish my accomplishments to maintain her own sense of superiority had become a trusted advisor and collaborator. The sister who'd spent years trying to prove her worth through external achievements was now finding fulfillment in work that aligned with her values and contributed to her community. Most importantly, we'd both learned that success wasn't a zero-sum game, where one person's achievements diminished another's worth. Instead, we discovered that our different strengths and perspectives could complement each other in ways that made both of us more effective and fulfilled. The call came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning in late April, jarring me awake from the deep sleep I'd finally learned to appreciate after years of being on call. It was Jennifer Morrison, Rachel's attorney, and the urgency in her voice immediately swept away any lingering drowsiness. "Mika, I need you to get to Rachel immediately," she said without preamble. "There's been a development in her case, and it's not good." My heart rate spiked as I threw on clothes and grabbed my keys. What kind of development? The agency's former CEO just tried to implicate Rachel in a plea bargain with federal prosecutors. He's claiming she was the mastermind behind the fraudulent billing scheme, and that he was just following her directions. It's complete fabrication, but we need to respond quickly and decisively. I found Rachel in her small office downtown, surrounded by legal documents and looking like she hadn't slept in days. The confident woman who'd been building her consulting practice with such enthusiasm had been replaced by someone who looked utterly defeated. She glanced up when I entered, and I saw fear in her eyes that reminded me of our childhood, when she'd come to me after nightmares. "They're saying I masterminded everything," she said without greeting, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Carl is claiming that all the fraudulent activities were my idea, that I threatened his job if he didn't go along with it. The prosecutors are apparently taking it seriously enough to reopen their investigation." I sat down across from her desk, trying to project calm even though my mind was racing with the implications. What evidence could he possibly have to support that claim? That's what's so terrifying, Rachel replied, running her hands through her hair. He doesn't need evidence that would hold up in court. He just needs to create enough doubt to make prosecutors think I might be worth investigating again. And in the meantime, my reputation gets destroyed all over again. My new clients start questioning whether they want to be associated with me, and I'm back to spending every penny I have on legal fees. Jennifer Morrison arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing the grim expression of someone delivering bad news. She spread papers across Rachel's conference table and began explaining the legal strategy that Carl Henderson, the former CEO, was apparently pursuing. He's hoping to reduce his potential sentence by offering federal prosecutors a bigger fish, Jennifer explained. In his version of events, Rachel was the senior executive who conceived and directed the fraudulent billing scheme, while he was just a victim of her manipulation and threats. But that's insane, I interjected. Rachel discovered the fraud and reported it. That's what got her fired. Which Carl is now claiming was an elaborate cover-up attempt, Jennifer replied grimly. He's arguing that when Rachel realized the investigation was getting close, she tried to pin everything on him by pretending to discover it herself. The audacity of the accusation was breathtaking, but I could see how it might be effective. Rachel had indeed been in a senior position. She had discovered the fraud, and she had been fired shortly after reporting it. In the hands of a skilled attorney, those facts could be arranged to support almost any narrative. What's our strategy? I asked, falling naturally into the role of Rachel's advocate and support system. Jennifer outlined a multi-pronged approach that would require documenting Rachel's complete professional history, gathering character witnesses, and, most importantly, proving that she lacked both the knowledge and access necessary to orchestrate the kind of sophisticated fraud Carl was describing. The good news is that Carl's story has holes, Jennifer explained. The fraudulent billing scheme required knowledge of systems and relationships that Rachel simply didn't have. We can demonstrate that she lacked access to the accounts and software necessary to create phantom clients and manipulate invoices. Over the next several days, I watched Rachel struggle with a level of stress and uncertainty that was completely foreign to her previous experience. She'd faced professional setbacks before, but never anything that threatened her freedom and fundamental reputation for honesty. The woman who'd always prided herself on her competence and control was discovering what it felt like to be completely powerless in the face of institutional forces. I keep thinking about what you went through with your abusive relationship, she told me one evening, as we worked through boxes of employment records in my living room. Not that this is the same thing, but there's something similar about having someone rewrite your reality, having them tell lies about you that other people might believe. The comparison was more apt than I'd initially realized. Both situations involved someone in a position of power using that power to manipulate narratives and control outcomes. Both required the victim to prove their innocence, rather than the accuser to prove guilt. Both created a sense of helplessness and isolation that was psychologically devastating. The difference, I pointed out, is that you have resources and support this time. You're not facing this alone. But even with resources and support, the strain was enormous. Rachel's consulting practice, which had been growing steadily, suddenly faced the reality that potential clients were hesitant to associate with someone under federal investigation. She lost 2 contracts in the first week after news of the renewed investigation became public. I understand why they're backing away, she said with forced pragmatism after receiving the second cancellation call. Healthcare organizations can't afford to be associated with anything that might damage their reputation. It's a rational business decision. I could see that she was trying to maintain professional equanimity, but the disappointment was evident in her voice. She'd worked so hard to rebuild her career around meaningful work, only to have it threatened by someone else's desperate lies. The emotional toll was compounded by the financial pressure. Legal fees for federal defense work were astronomical, and Rachel's savings, already depleted from her previous legal troubles, were disappearing rapidly. She'd started talking about selling her car and moving back in with me permanently. Conversations that revealed how completely her sense of security had been shattered. I can't ask you to support me indefinitely, she said during one particularly difficult conversation. You have your own business to run, your own life to live. I can't let Carl Henderson destroy both of our futures. He's not going to destroy anything, I replied firmly. We're going to prove he's lying, clear your name completely, and then you're going to rebuild your practice stronger than before. But privately, I was worried about more than just the immediate legal situation. I was watching Rachel retreat into herself in ways that reminded me of my own darkest periods. She was sleeping poorly, eating irregularly, and losing the enthusiasm for her work that had made her transformation so inspiring. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Webb, a former colleague of Rachel's from her early days in advertising, reached out after hearing about the renewed investigation. Marcus had left the agency years before the fraud began, but he remembered details about the financial systems and reporting structures that would prove crucial to Rachel's defense. Rachel never had access to the billing systems, Marcus explained during a conference call with Jennifer Morrison. That was always controlled directly by Carl and the finance director. Rachel worked on the creative and strategic side. She wouldn't have known how to create phantom clients even if she'd wanted to. More importantly, Marcus had saved emails from his time at the agency that documented the power structure and decision-making processes. These emails clearly showed that financial operations were Carl's exclusive domain, and that other executives, including Rachel, were deliberately kept out of billing and accounting discussions. Carl was obsessive about controlling financial information, Marcus continued. He claimed it was about confidentiality and competitive advantage, but it also meant that no one else really understood how the money flowed through the organization. Jennifer Morrison's excitement was palpable as she reviewed Marcus's documentation. "This is exactly what we need," she said. "We can prove that Rachel lacked the access and knowledge necessary to orchestrate the fraud, and we can show that Carl had a pattern of excluding other executives from financial decision-making." As our defense strategy solidified, I watched Rachel begin to regain some of her confidence and determination. The evidence was strong, and Jennifer was optimistic about our chances of not only avoiding charges, but of exposing Carl's accusations as the desperate fabrications they were. "I want to do more than just defend myself," Rachel told me as we prepared for a crucial meeting with federal prosecutors. "I want to make sure Carl faces consequences for trying to destroy my life with lies." The meeting with prosecutors took place in Denver on a cold May morning. Rachel, Jennifer, and I sat across from 3 federal attorneys who listened impassively as Jennifer presented our evidence. The documentation was comprehensive and compelling, clearly demonstrating that Carl's accusations were not only false, but logically impossible, given the agency's organizational structure. Mr. Henderson's plea negotiations appear to be based on fictional events, Jennifer concluded. Our client not only lacked the means to commit the fraud he's describing, but her actions in discovering and reporting the fraud are completely inconsistent with his version of events. The lead prosecutor asked sharp questions about the timeline and the evidence, but I could see that Rachel's case was strong. More importantly, I could see that the prosecutors were beginning to understand that Carl Henderson was trying to manipulate the justice system for his own benefit. "We'll need time to review this material and conduct our own investigation," the prosecutor said finally. "But based on what you've presented today, it seems unlikely that we'll be pursuing charges against Ms. Martinez." Walking out of the federal building that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of relief and vindication. Rachel had been vindicated not just legally but morally. The truth had prevailed over Carl Henderson's desperate lies, and justice had been served. "It's really over," Rachel said as we drove back to Fort Collins, and for the first time in months, she sounded like herself again. "It's really over," I agreed. "Now you can focus on rebuilding your practice and moving forward." But even as we celebrated the legal victory, I knew that the real test would be Rachel's ability to recover emotionally and professionally from the ordeal. She'd been through a traumatic experience that had shaken her confidence and forced her to confront her own vulnerability in ways she'd never experienced before. The woman sitting beside me in the car was different from the one who'd arrived in Colorado months earlier. She'd been tested by adversity in ways that stripped away pretense and revealed character. She'd discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed, and learned to accept help without feeling diminished by it. Most importantly, she'd learned that success wasn't just about individual achievement, but about the relationships and support systems that sustain us through difficult times. The sister who'd once valued independence above all else had discovered the power of interdependence and mutual support. As we reached Fort Collins and pulled into my driveway, Rachel turned to me with an expression of gratitude and determination that I'll never forget. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. For supporting me when I had nothing to offer in return. For showing me what family really means." "That's what sisters do," I replied, echoing the words I'd spoken months earlier but with deeper understanding of their truth. The crisis was over, but the transformation it had created in both of us would last forever. 6 months after the federal prosecutors officially closed their investigation and confirmed that no charges would be filed against Rachel, I stood in the conference room of her newly expanded consulting practice, watching her present a comprehensive healthcare communications strategy to the board of directors of Colorado Springs Medical Center. The transformation was complete, but it was more profound than anyone could have anticipated from the outside. The woman commanding the room with quiet authority and deep expertise bore little resemblance to the desperate, defeated person who'd arrived at my doorstep nearly 2 years earlier. Rachel had rebuilt not just her career, but her entire understanding of what professional success could look like. Her consulting practice now employed 4 people and served healthcare organizations throughout Colorado and neighboring states. "Patient communication isn't just about marketing," Rachel was explaining to the board members, her voice confident but never condescending. "It's about building trust through transparency, helping people make informed decisions about their health, and creating connections that improve both patient outcomes and organizational reputation." I watched the board members nod thoughtfully as Rachel outlined her recommendations. She'd learned to speak the language of healthcare leaders while maintaining the strategic thinking that had always been her strength. More importantly, she'd developed a genuine passion for improving healthcare communication that was evident in every aspect of her presentation. The data shows that patients who receive clear, compassionate communication are more likely to follow treatment recommendations, report higher satisfaction scores, and recommend the organization to others, she continued, clicking through slides that demonstrated measurable improvements at client facilities. Better communication isn't just the right thing to do, it's also good business. After the presentation concluded, and the board members filed out with unanimous approval for Rachel's proposed project, we sat alone in the conference room overlooking downtown Colorado Springs. The mountain views through the windows seemed to stretch endlessly, a visual metaphor for the possibilities that lay ahead. 2 years ago, I would have been focused entirely on impressing them with my credentials and expertise, Rachel reflected, gathering her materials. Today, I was focused on solving their problems and helping their patients. It's a completely different mindset. The shift she was describing represented more than just a change in professional approach. It reflected a fundamental transformation in how she understood value creation and personal fulfillment. The woman who'd once measured success solely through external recognition had learned to find meaning in impact and service. "What's next for you?" I asked as we prepared to drive back to Fort Collins. "Expansion, but thoughtful expansion," she replied. "I've been approached about opening an office in Denver, maybe one in Phoenix. The demand for healthcare communications consulting is growing faster than I can meet it." But even as she discussed growth opportunities, I could hear the careful consideration in her voice. The Rachel who'd once pursued advancement without regard for personal cost had been replaced by someone who weighed opportunities against their alignment with her values and their impact on her quality of life. "I want to grow the practice, but I also want to maintain the culture we've created," she explained as we drove north through the Colorado landscape. "Everyone on my team is passionate about improving healthcare communication. They're not just employees, they're collaborators in a mission that matters. I won't sacrifice that for rapid growth or higher profits." This conversation continued over dinner that evening as Rachel outlined her vision for the future of her practice. She wanted to develop training programs for healthcare professionals, create standardized communication protocols that could be adopted widely, and eventually establish a foundation that would provide communication consulting services to underserved healthcare organizations. "I keep thinking about what you said years ago about fulfillment versus recognition," she told me as we sat on my back deck, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "I finally understand what you meant. The recognition is nice when it comes, but the fulfillment is what sustains you day after day." The irony wasn't lost on either of us that Rachel's pursuit of meaningful work had ultimately brought her more recognition than she'd ever achieved in traditional advertising. Her innovative approaches to healthcare communication had earned her speaking invitations at national conferences, feature articles in industry publications, and consulting requests from organizations across the country. "Success found me when I stopped chasing it," she observed with a laugh. "All those years I was focused on climbing ladders and accumulating status symbols, I was missing the point entirely." But perhaps the most significant transformation wasn't professional but personal. The relationship between Rachel and me had evolved into something neither of us could have imagined during our years of misunderstanding and competition. We'd become true partners, supporting each other's goals while maintaining our individual identities and pursuits. "I need to tell you something," Rachel said, her tone becoming more serious. "The way you supported me through the legal crisis, the way you opened your recurvia home in your life to me when I had nowhere else to turn, the way you believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. It changed everything for me." I started to deflect the gratitude, but she continued before I could speak. "No, let me finish. You taught me what unconditional support looks like, what family really means when it's not based on competition or comparison. You showed me that helping someone else succeed doesn't diminish your own accomplishments. That lesson has changed how I approach every relationship in my life." The truth was, supporting Rachel through her crisis had changed me as well. I'd discovered that my own success felt more meaningful when it was shared, when it could serve as a foundation for helping others achieve their goals. The facilities I'd built, the business I'd created, the expertise I'd developed, all of it became more valuable when it could be used to support the people I cared about. "We make a good team," I said simply, and Rachel smiled with genuine warmth. "We always did," she replied. "We just needed to figure out how to be teammates instead of competitors." As autumn arrived in Colorado, Rachel's practice continued to flourish, while my own facilities expanded their services and reach. We'd begun collaborating formally on projects that combined her communication expertise with my operational knowledge, creating solutions that neither of us could have developed independently. The partnership felt natural and productive, built on mutual respect and complementary skills, rather than the complicated dynamics that had characterized our relationship for so many years. We challenged each other professionally while supporting each other personally, a balance that enriched both our work and our family bond. One evening in late October, as we reviewed a joint proposal for a statewide healthcare communication initiative, Rachel paused in her work and looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone through the crisis with Carl and the agency?" she asked. I considered the question seriously. "I think you would have continued being successful in traditional terms, but I don't think you would have found the kind of fulfillment you have now." "I agree," she said. "As terrible as it was at the time, I needed something that dramatic to force me to examine my priorities and rebuild from the foundation up." The crisis had indeed been transformational, but not in ways that either of us could have predicted. It had stripped away Rachel's professional armor and forced her to confront fundamental questions about purpose and value. It had also given us the opportunity to support each other in ways that revealed the strength of our family bond. "The best part," Rachel continued, "is that I'm not the only one who's changed. You've become more confident about sharing your success, more willing to let people see the full scope of what you've accomplished. You're not hiding behind humility anymore." She was right. The experience of supporting Rachel through her crisis had taught me that there was a difference between modesty and self-diminishment. I'd learned to own my accomplishments fully while using them to lift others up rather than to establish superiority. As the year drew to a close, Rachel and I found ourselves reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. From the awkward family reunion where our old dynamics had finally exploded into the open, through the months of rebuilding trust and understanding, to the crisis that had tested and ultimately strengthened our relationship, we'd traveled an enormous distance together. "I keep thinking about that reunion," Rachel said during one of our regular evening conversations. "How certain I was that I understood success. How dismissive I was of what you'd accomplished. How completely wrong I was about almost everything." "You weren't wrong about everything," I pointed out. "You were right about the importance of ambition and strategic thinking and building something meaningful. You just had a narrow definition of what those things could look like. The woman sitting across from me now embodied all of those qualities, but in service of goals that aligned with her deepest values. She was ambitious about improving healthcare communication, strategic about building a sustainable practice, and dedicated to creating something that would outlast her own career. "What I've realized," Rachel said, "is that the most important success isn't what you achieve for yourself, but what you make possible for others. Your success created opportunities for hundreds of employees and thousands of patients. My success is starting to create opportunities for healthcare organizations to serve their communities better." This understanding of success as a platform for service rather than just personal achievement represented the culmination of Rachel's transformation. She'd moved from a scarcity mindset where success was limited and competitive to an abundance mindset where success could be shared and multiplied. As we entered the new year, both of our businesses continued to grow and evolve. But more importantly, our relationship had found a sustainable foundation built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. We'd learned to celebrate each other's achievements without feeling diminished, to support each other through challenges without feeling burdened, and to collaborate professionally while maintaining our individual identities. The sister who'd once called me just a nurse had become one of my closest advisors and strongest supporters. The woman who dismissed healthcare as insufficiently sophisticated had built her career around serving the healthcare sector. The relationship that had been defined by misunderstanding and competition had evolved into one of the most meaningful partnerships in both our lives. Looking back on our journey, I realized that the moment of revelation at the family reunion had been just the beginning. The real transformation had happened slowly, through countless conversations and shared experiences that rebuilt our relationship from the ground up. It had required vulnerability from both of us, forgiveness for past hurts, and the courage to reimagine what our connection could become. The woman I am today is still the same person who built 3 successful medical facilities while wearing scrubs and shopping at Target. But I'm also someone who learned that hiding your light doesn't serve anyone, that success shared is success multiplied, and that the most important relationships in life are worth fighting for and rebuilding when necessary. Rachel and I proved that siblings can overcome years of misunderstanding, that success doesn't have to be competitive, and that crisis can be the catalyst for profound, positive change. We discovered that when you stop trying to prove your worth to others and start focusing on creating value for the world, both recognition and fulfillment follow naturally. Most importantly, we learned that the greatest success of all is building relationships based on truth, respect, and unconditional support. Everything else is just details. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.